Hey friends, tonight we're starting a journey through a part of history that doesn't show up in school textbooks or dusty museum plaques. It's a story that was whispered, dismissed, or misdiagnosed for centuries. How women's anxiety has been treated throughout history. This isn't just about outdated medicine or strange old rituals. This is about how generations of women were misunderstood, silenced, and often punished just for feeling afraid, overwhelmed, or unheard. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's the truth, woven through ancient philosophies, religious doctrines, scientific misunderstandings, and cultural norms that all seem to agree on one thing. A woman in distress must be broken. So before we dive in, take a second to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy content that uncovers the hidden truths of the past. And feel free to leave a comment with where you're listening from. I love seeing our little history-loving community grow across time zones and borders. Now, dim the lights, take a breath, and let's begin where so many stories do, at the beginning. Our first stop, ancient Greece, a land of towering columns, philosophical debates, and strangely specific ideas about the human body. In this world, if you were a woman experiencing panic attacks, shortness of breath, or a sudden dread, you wouldn't have been diagnosed with anxiety. You'd have been told your womb had gone rogue. Seriously. The Greek physician Hippocrates, yes, the same guy whose oath doctors still reference, proposed that women's emotional disturbances were caused by a condition called hysteria. The root word? Hystera, which literally means uterus. According to him and his contemporaries, if a woman was celibate for too long, or overly emotional, or just seemed out of sorts, it wasn't her brain they were worried about. It was her uterus. They believed it had become restless, dislodged itself from its rightful place, and was now floating through her body, causing chaos, tightness in the chest, shortness of breath, even seizures. A wandering womb, as they called it. And the treatment? Not talk therapy, not even rest. Doctors would try to lure the uterus back into place using smells, sweet aromas near the pelvis, foul stenches near the nose. Imagine lying still while someone burns garlic or rotting meat near your face, hoping your uterus would decide to retreat back downward. It's almost too absurd to believe, but this was considered medical fact. Women weren't asked about their emotions or inner lives. They were examined like broken machines, with one faulty part to blame. But it wasn't just about faulty science. These ideas reflected how women were seen: fragile, irrational, biologically inferior. Women couldn't vote, own land, or participate in the philosophical debates held in stone courtyards. Their pain, their fear, their trauma wasn't considered real unless it could be physically measured, or, in this case, blamed on a rebellious uterus. Still, despite the ridiculousness of the theory, what's tragic is the real suffering underneath it. Women were struggling with grief, fear, loss, and social pressure. But instead of being heard, they were handed incense and assumptions. Their voices were quieted, their pain rebranded as a gynecological issue. And with that, the silence began. Let's fast forward slightly to ancient Rome, another empire of advancement, innovation, and deeply flawed ideas about female mental health. Roman medicine carried many beliefs from Greek philosophy, but gave them new names. Anxiety became furor uterinalis, which might sound like a dramatic opera, but was actually just Latin for womb madness. And if you were a woman in Rome dealing with what we now know as anxiety, you wouldn't be offered compassion. You'd be told to get married. Quickly. Roman physicians believed that emotional instability was rooted in reproductive inactivity. No husband, no child. Clearly, your body was malfunctioning. The treatment? Childbirth. And not just once, repeatedly. Emotional calmness was believed to be achieved through fulfilling your maternal duty. And if that didn't help, well, maybe you were just failing at being a woman. One physician, Cyrenus of Ephesus, who wrote a comprehensive medical text on gynecology, recommended that women avoid strong emotions altogether, as if it were a matter of willpower. He also suggested that husbands be gentle, which in Roman terms meant maybe not yelling at dinner. Wealthy women who showed signs of anxiety might be given wine and music, while poorer women were offered herbs, superstition, or outright neglect. Crying too much? Clearly a sign of spiritual weakness. Disagreeing with your husband? Dangerous territory. And if you pushed too far, if you wept for too long, spoke too loudly, or simply didn't perform the role expected of you, you could be accused of being possessed by spirits or suffering divine punishment. The solution? A priest, a ritual, and a whole lot of public shame. Anxiety wasn't seen as a mental experience. It wasn't seen as a valid response to difficult conditions. It was seen as a failure of biology, of femininity, of self-control. And once again, women's pain became something to hide, to punish, or to spiritualize, never to understand. So as aqueducts brought water through Roman cities and laws were carved into marble, a woman's inner life remained a mystery, ignored, misjudged, and frequently condemned. In this world, a trembling hand or tear-streaked face wasn't a signal of distress. It was a symptom of womanhood gone wrong, and the silence deepened. Section 2. As we continue our journey into the murky waters of history, we now step into the long shadow of the Middle Ages, a time when fear wore many faces and reason often took a back seat to religion. If ancient Greece had birthed the myth of the wandering womb, and Rome had doubled down with forced motherhood as a cure, the Middle Ages took women's anxiety and baptized it in fire. This was not an age of progress for mental health. It was an era of superstition, fear, and deeply entrenched patriarchal authority where the line between illness and evil was thin and easily crossed. During this period, the church wasn't just a spiritual authority. It was the central institution that dictated law, morality, and even medicine. If you were a woman suffering from symptoms we now recognize as anxiety, palpitations, breathlessness, trembling, intrusive thoughts, your affliction would not be viewed through the lens of trauma or psychology. No, it would be interpreted as a spiritual failing, or worse, demonic possession. You see, hysteria didn't disappear in the Middle Ages. It simply changed costume. It became fused with the supernatural, with sin and shame. A woman who trembled, who cried at night, who struggled to sleep or felt panic for no apparent reason, wasn't seen as someone in need of care. She was a threat, a vessel through which the devil could work. And when you live in a world ruled by fire and faith, threats must be eliminated. The Greek theory of the wandering womb still lingered in medical texts, passed down and recopied by monastic scribes, but it now coexisted with another powerful idea, that the devil preyed upon weak souls. And what soul was weaker, more impressionable, more dangerous in its emotions than that of a woman? Enter the exorcists, the inquisitors, the public tribunals. Women expressing strong emotions were at risk of being labeled witches, especially if they dared to speak out, heal with herbs, or grieve too loudly. Anxiety, in this context, was not a symptom of mental strain. It was a sign of spiritual corruption. Healing came not in the form of medicine, but rituals. Exorcisms, forced confessions, isolation, dunking trials, burning. It's impossible to overstate how devastating this was. Imagine living in a world where your panic attacks were interpreted as signs that Satan had set up camp in your chest, where intrusive thoughts were treated as evidence of black magic, where your emotional breakdown could end with a noose, a torch, or a river. If your grief after losing a child lasted too long, if your trembling persisted, if your silence was mistaken for suspicion, your fate was no longer yours to decide. Yet, not all hope was lost. In quieter corners of this dark timeline, there were nuns, monasteries, and infirmaries where women in distress were tended to, though treatment often meant silence, prayer, and fasting. Fainting spells were met with holy water. Tremors were treated with isolation. No one asked about past trauma. No one explored emotional wounds. The question wasn't, what happened to you? It was, what sin have you committed? Diagnostic tools were equally medieval. If a woman flinched when a crucifix was pressed to her forehead, it could be taken as proof of possession. Herbalism, previously a staple of care among women, became suspect. Knowing too much about the stars or plants could get you condemned. Suffering anxiety in a world like this didn't just mean being ignored. It meant being actively punished for your pain. It's important to remember that most of these women were simply struggling. They were human beings trying to survive in a world that offered them no safety net, no understanding, and no language for what they felt. They didn't need exorcists or dunking chairs. They needed empathy, a place to speak, someone to say, "I believe you." But empathy was scarce, and so the silence spread. Then came the Renaissance. Art, science, literature, all experienced a rebirth. Michelangelo was chiseling David, Da Vinci was sketching helicopters, and the printing press was spreading knowledge like wildfire. But even as the world marveled at new ideas and rediscovered ancient texts, women's mental health was still viewed through the same warped lens. If anything, the Renaissance rebranded hysteria with a more polished vocabulary, but the core ideas remained unchanged. Doctors, still predominantly male, continued to treat female anxiety as a reproductive issue. If you were feeling anxious, you were told it was because you weren't married. If you were panicking, the solution was to conceive. If you were depressed, it was time for a good bleeding. Or, better yet, leeches. Yes, leeches. They were used to balance the humors, a medical theory that held sway for centuries. The body, they believed, had four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were anxious, clearly your blood was too hot, or your bile too plentiful. The treatment? Bleeding, cupping, or placing leeches on your skin until you grew pale and fainted. Not exactly comforting. And if you were lucky, you might be prescribed rest in a countryside estate. But rest, in this case, didn't mean healing. It meant being watched, silenced, and isolated until you smiled again, or at least stopped crying in public. Women were often confined to dark rooms, forbidden to read or write, told to sit quietly with their thoughts. Because in this newly enlightened world, a woman who thought too much was still a danger to herself. Reading was discouraged because it might excite the imagination. Emotional expression was condemned as hysteria. And heaven forbid a woman asked too many questions. That was hazardous to her womb stability. In elite homes, this was called rest. In less privileged homes, it was simply neglect. The result was the same. A woman in distress was told she was the problem. Not the pressure, not the expectations, not the grief, just her. So while artists painted masterpieces and symphonies echoed through marble halls, countless women sat in silence behind chamber doors, wondering if maybe the doctors were right. Maybe they were broken. Maybe their pain really was a personal failure. And so, the silence endured. Section 3. As the Renaissance gave way to the Age of Enlightenment, the Western world began embracing logic, reason, and science with newfound zeal. Philosophers debated liberty, natural rights, and the mechanics of the universe. Telescopes peered into the cosmos. Newton explained gravity. The human mind itself became a subject of study. But for all this intellectual progress, one crucial element remained largely untouched: compassion for women's emotional suffering. Once again, society advanced without taking women along for the ride. In this age of illuminated thinking, if you were a woman struggling with what we now know as anxiety, sleepless nights, racing thoughts, or sudden waves of dread, you were no longer possessed by demons, nor was your womb accused of wandering. No, now you were a nervous lady. It sounded more elegant, maybe even respectful. But behind the title was the same old belief that women were biologically and spiritually fragile, inherently predisposed to emotional instability. The idea of hysteria didn't vanish. It just put on a powdered wig. Doctors began studying the nervous system in earnest and concluded that women, due to their delicate composition, had too many nerves, too much sensitivity, too much imagination. Their minds were like musical instruments tuned too tightly, always ready to snap or sing at the slightest provocation. Anxiety was no longer demonic, but it was still a defect, one tied explicitly to gender. The treatments changed in form, but not in spirit. If you were considered overly anxious, you might be prescribed warm baths, gentle walks, or the new darling of Enlightenment medicine, laudanum. A potent mix of alcohol and opium, laudanum promised to calm your nerves, soften your pain, and silence your complaints all at once. It numbed the body and the mind, and for a brief moment, it may have felt like peace. But dependency was common, and understanding was still absent. Wealthier women were sent to quiet retreats, often beautiful country homes where they were encouraged to avoid reading, thinking, or engaging in any discussion that might excite the nerves. They were dressed, fed, and put to bed like fragile porcelain dolls. But they were also silenced. No one asked about trauma, loss, or fear. The goal wasn't to understand their distress. It was to mute it. For poorer women, there were no retreats, no laudanum, no physicians with Latin diagnoses. There was simply endurance. They kept moving. They kept quiet. And when their emotional exhaustion erupted, when they shouted, sobbed, or fell apart, they were dismissed as mad, unstable, unfit. And if you dared speak up, if you expressed rage, discontent, or even ambition, your anxiety was no longer merely inconvenient. It was threatening. A woman who disrupted the expected serenity of domestic life could be confined. Not with a trial, not with due process, just a husband's signature, a father's approval, and the door to the asylum would close behind you. These institutions weren't built for healing. They were built for hiding, for locking away the inconvenient, the loud, the troubled, for placing women out of sight until they returned to acceptable behavior, or didn't return at all. In the Enlightenment, reason was king, and yet, when women voiced their pain, it wasn't met with inquiry. It was met with sedation. A woman could have the same symptoms as a man, sleeplessness, panic, racing thoughts, but only hers would be treated as a feminine flaw, a deviation from grace. For men, anxiety might be linked to pressure, duty, war. For women, it was tied to hormones, hysteria, and the perils of thinking too much. By the 19th century, this way of thinking had matured into something more structured and far more insidious. Welcome to the Victorian era, an age of manners, modesty, and obsession with appearances, where the teacups were dainty, the corsets were suffocating, and emotional expression in women was seen as entirely indecent. Here, anxiety was not a word people used, but the symptoms were everywhere. Women fainted from nervous exhaustion, wept behind closed doors, and were told to lie still, be quiet, and surrender themselves to the latest cure, enforced rest. Developed by Dr. Silas Ware Mitchell, a man respected for his intellect, but not his empathy, the rest cure was designed specifically for women diagnosed with nervous disorders. You felt tired? You felt anxious? You cried for no clear reason? Then bed was your prescription. For weeks, sometimes months. No reading, no writing, no visitors, no talking about your feelings. Just soft pillows, boiled milk, and endless quiet. The theory was that any mental exertion would worsen your condition, that you needed to empty yourself of all thought, ambition, or emotion to heal. But many women did not heal. In fact, they broke. One of the most haunting accounts of this treatment comes from Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer who endured the rest cure and later penned The Yellow Wallpaper, a short story about a woman slowly driven mad by her confinement. The tale is fictional, but the pain beneath it is not. Gilman, like so many others, didn't need rest. She needed to be heard. The Victorian ideal of womanhood demanded that women be calm, composed, angelic. Anxiety didn't fit this image, so it was silenced beautifully, quietly, tragically. And if you didn't recover from the rest cure, if your tears continued or your silence deepened, there was always the asylum. These were not places of peace. They were institutions of control. Inside, women were subjected to treatments that ranged from morphine injections to electroshock therapy, ice baths, isolation, restraints, observation, cry too much, talk too fast, fail to smile on command. It was enough to be labeled unwell. And still, no one asked, what happened to you? Had you lost a child? Suffered abuse? Was the weight of expectation simply too much to carry? Those questions were never asked, because the answers might have implicated the very structure society was built on: marriage, motherhood, morality. So women remained behind locked doors, not because they were dangerous, but because their pain disrupted the illusion. The illusion that everything was fine, that women were fine. Section 3. As the Renaissance gave way to the Age of Enlightenment, the Western world began embracing logic, reason, and science with newfound zeal. Philosophers debated liberty, natural rights, and the mechanics of the universe. Telescopes peered into the cosmos. Newton explained gravity. The human mind itself became a subject of study. But for all this intellectual progress, one crucial element remained largely untouched: compassion for women's emotional suffering. Once again, society advanced, without taking women along for the ride. In this age of illuminated thinking, if you were a woman struggling with what we now know as anxiety, sleepless nights, racing thoughts, or sudden waves of dread, you were no longer possessed by demons, nor was your womb accused of wandering. No, now you were a nervous lady. It sounded more elegant, maybe even respectful. But behind the title was the same old belief that women were biologically and spiritually fragile, inherently predisposed to emotional instability. The idea of hysteria didn't vanish. It just put on a powdered wig. Doctors began studying the nervous system in earnest and concluded that women, due to their delicate composition, had too many nerves, too much sensitivity, too much imagination. Their minds were like musical instruments tuned too tightly, always ready to snap or sing at the slightest provocation. Anxiety was no longer demonic, but it was still a defect, one tied explicitly to gender. The treatments changed in form, but not in spirit. If you were considered overly anxious, you might be prescribed warm baths, gentle walks, or the new darling of Enlightenment medicine, laudanum. A potent mix of alcohol and opium, laudanum promised to calm your nerves, soften your pain, and silence your complaints, all at once. It numbed the body and the mind, and for a brief moment, it may have felt like peace. But dependency was common, and understanding was still absent. Wealthier women were sent to quiet retreats, often beautiful country homes where they were encouraged to avoid reading, thinking, or engaging in any discussion that might excite the nerves. They were dressed, fed, and put to bed like fragile porcelain dolls. But they were also silenced. No one asked about trauma, loss, or fear. The goal wasn't to understand their distress. It was to mute it. For poorer women, there were no retreats, no laudanum, no physicians with Latin diagnoses. There was simply endurance. They kept moving. They kept quiet. And when their emotional exhaustion erupted, when they shouted, sobbed, or fell apart, they were dismissed as mad, unstable, unfit. And if you dared speak up, if you expressed rage, discontent, or even ambition, your anxiety was no longer merely inconvenient. It was threatening. A woman who disrupted the expected serenity of domestic life could be confined. Not with a trial, not with due process, just a husband's signature, a father's approval, and the door to the asylum would close behind you. These institutions weren't built for healing. They were built for hiding, for locking away the inconvenient, the loud, the troubled, for placing women out of sight until they returned to acceptable behavior, or didn't return at all. In the Enlightenment, reason was king. And yet, when women voiced their pain, it wasn't met with inquiry. It was met with sedation. A woman could have the same symptoms as a man: sleeplessness, panic, racing thoughts, but only hers would be treated as a feminine flaw, a deviation from grace. For men, anxiety might be linked to pressure, duty, war. For women, it was tied to hormones, hysteria, and the perils of thinking too much. By the 19th century, this way of thinking had matured into something more structured and far more insidious. Welcome to the Victorian era, an age of manners, modesty, and obsession with appearances, where the teacups were dainty, the corsets were suffocating, and emotional expression in women was seen as entirely indecent. Here, anxiety was not a word people used, but the symptoms were everywhere. Women fainted from nervous exhaustion, wept behind closed doors, and were told to lie still, be quiet, and surrender themselves to the latest cure, enforced rest. Developed by Dr. Silas Ware Mitchell, a man respected for his intellect, but not his empathy. The rest cure was designed specifically for women diagnosed with nervous disorders. You felt tired? You felt anxious? You cried for no clear reason? Then bed was your prescription. For weeks, sometimes months. No reading, no writing, no visitors, no talking about your feelings. Just soft pillows, boiled milk, and endless quiet. The theory was that any mental exertion would worsen your condition, that you needed to empty yourself of all thought, ambition, or emotion to heal. But many women did not heal. In fact, they broke. One of the most haunting accounts of this treatment comes from Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer who endured the rest cure and later penned The Yellow Wallpaper, a short story about a woman slowly driven mad by her confinement. The tale is fictional, but the pain beneath it is not. Gilman, like so many others, didn't need rest. She needed to be heard. The Victorian ideal of womanhood demanded that women be calm, composed, angelic. Anxiety didn't fit this image, so it was silenced, beautifully, quietly, tragically. And if you didn't recover from the rest cure, if your tears continued or your silence deepened, there was always the asylum. These were not places of peace. They were institutions of control. Inside, women were subjected to treatments that ranged from morphine injections to electroshock therapy, ice baths, isolation, restraints, observation, cry too much, talk too fast, fail to smile on command. It was enough to be labeled unwell. And still, no one asked, what happened to you? Had you lost a child? Suffered abuse? Was the weight of expectation simply too much to carry? Those questions were never asked, because the answers might have implicated the very structure society was built on: marriage, motherhood, morality. So women remained behind locked doors, not because they were dangerous, but because their pain disrupted the illusion that everything was fine, that women were fine. Section 5. By the time the 1980s and 1990s arrived, the world of mental health had changed on the surface, but underneath, the same old patterns still echoed. This was the era when women's anxiety finally received formal names. No longer dismissed simply as nerves or hysteria, it now had clinical labels: generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. These terms found their way into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, better known as the DSM. And at last, the medical community began to offer women a kind of legitimacy. The pain had a name, but a name wasn't always enough. Because even with new diagnoses and seemingly more advanced understanding, the lived experience of anxious women still carried familiar burdens: doubt, dismissal, and condescension. Let's say you were a woman in 1993 having panic attacks. Your heart raced, your hands trembled, your chest felt like it was closing in. You walked into a doctor's office, desperate for answers. What did you get? Likely a pamphlet, maybe a prescription for Xanax, and a vague suggestion to take it easy. At least they weren't blaming your uterus anymore. Now they blamed your lifestyle. You're probably just stressed. Maybe you're working too hard. Have you tried jogging? And so the cycle continued. Anxiety was acknowledged but still not understood. Therapy had become more accessible, but finding a therapist who wouldn't reduce your fear to hormones or overreaction, that could still be a challenge. If you cried in session, you were labeled fragile. If you didn't, maybe you were in denial. Either way, your story was filtered through a lens of suspicion. Yet for many women, finally having a name for what they felt was profound. It was like being handed a mirror after decades in the dark. You're not crazy, the diagnosis said. You're human, and this has a shape. And that alone was a kind of relief, a form of validation. Medications, too, evolved. The rise of SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, marked a shift away from tranquilizers and toward longer-term treatment plans. Drugs like Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil became household names. Magazine ads featured smiling women running through fields or hugging their children, the fine print promising balanced brain chemistry and emotional relief. And for many, these medications genuinely helped. They provided clarity, stability, and calm. but they often came without full explanations. No one was asking deeper questions about trauma, about history, about generational pain. The approach was still narrowly clinical. Here's the pill, see you in 6 weeks. And as the labels multiplied, so did the sense of being categorized. Women began to carry their diagnoses like quiet weights. I have anxiety became both a truth and a permission slip to speak, to rest, to be taken seriously. But it also came with stigma. At job interviews, in relationships, in families. Because even with the right vocabulary, society still hadn't caught up. To be an anxious woman in the 90s was to be in transition, between eras, between silence and speech. You weren't accused of witchcraft anymore, but you still might be told you were overreacting. You weren't locked in a rest cure, but you were told to take a spa day. You weren't given leeches, but you might be offered lavender oil and a patronizing smile. The language had changed. The treatments had changed. But the subtext was the same. This is still your fault. Fix yourself. And then came the 2000s. The turn of the millennium ushered in something entirely new, the digital age. Suddenly, you didn't have to walk into a therapist's office to talk about your anxiety. You could log on. Forums, blogs, early social media. Women began sharing their stories online, anonymously at first, but with growing boldness. They compared symptoms, described panic attacks, debated medications, and most importantly, they recognized each other. And what they discovered was unsettling, that across cities, countries, continents, the story was repeating itself. Different lives, same ache, same pressure, same shame. And then something radical entered the clinical mainstream, trauma-informed care. This wasn't just another diagnosis. It was a shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with you?" this new model asked, "What happened to you?" It wasn't about labeling a woman's fear. It was about tracing it, understanding the root, connecting it to real events, real patterns, real environments that had pushed her nervous system into high alert. What if your anxiety wasn't a chemical glitch? What if it was your body remembering pain you couldn't articulate? This changed everything. For the first time, therapists began to view anxiety not as a malfunction, but as a signal, a response, a wound, not a weakness. And that gave women a framework to understand the full complexity of their experience. Not just the biology, but the history. Not just the brain, but the life. Trauma-informed care wasn't perfect. Access was uneven. Many therapists still didn't practice it, but it planted a seed. And women who had spent decades being medicated, silenced, or pathologized began to see their fear through a new lens. This was the era when words like boundaries, triggers, and self-regulation began to enter the mainstream. Some dismissed it as pop psychology. But for those who had lived through generations of shame, it was a revelation. Your anxiety isn't irrational. Your fear makes sense. You're not overreacting. You're responding to something that hurt. But society doesn't shift overnight. Women were still expected to be calm under pressure, to juggle homes, careers, children, aging parents, and now, mental health plans. The pressure was relentless. The vocabulary had changed, but the expectations hadn't. Still, something was beginning to move. The cultural script had started to flip, from "you're too emotional" to "you've been through a lot," from "you're broken" to "you've survived." And for the first time in recorded history, that shift wasn't just happening in private therapy rooms or hushed feminist circles. It was happening everywhere, on blogs, in books, in classrooms, and slowly, even in boardrooms. As the 21st century unfolded, the conversation around women's mental health began to shift in profound ways. The rise of trauma-informed care, TC, marked a significant departure from traditional models that often pathologized women's experiences without context. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with you?" TIC prompted a more compassionate inquiry. What happened to you? This paradigm shift acknowledged that many women's mental health challenges stem from complex trauma histories, including childhood abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, and systemic oppression. Recognizing these factors, healthcare providers began to adopt practices that emphasized safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. core principles of TIC. One notable development was the integration of TC into perinatal care. Recognizing that childbirth can be a traumatic experience for some women, healthcare systems started implementing screening tools like the Adverse Childhood Experiences (ACE) questionnaire during prenatal visits. This approach aimed to identify women at risk of postpartum depression or post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) and provide them with appropriate support services. In England, the National Health Service (NHS) expanded its perinatal mental health services, with 64,000 women accessing specialist care in the past year, a 10% increase from 2023. These services offer counseling, peer support, and medication management, addressing conditions such as postnatal depression, PTSD, and tocophobia, a severe fear of childbirth. Similarly, in Australia, the introduction of the PILAR framework, preparation, introduction, listening, apology, and reassurance, by Dr. Priya Rao aimed to assist anesthetists in addressing psychological birth trauma. This tool emphasizes the importance of communication and empathy in creating a supportive environment for mothers post-delivery. Beyond perinatal care, TSE principles have been applied in various settings, including mental health services, substance abuse treatment, and domestic violence shelters. Research indicates that trauma-informed interventions can lead to statistically significant improvements in women's trauma and mental health symptoms over a 12-month period. However, challenges remain. Access to trauma-informed services is not uniform, and many women, particularly those from marginalized communities, continue to face barriers to care. Cultural stigmas, lack of awareness, and limited resources can hinder the implementation of THC practices. Despite these obstacles, the momentum toward trauma-informed approaches reflects a growing recognition of the need to address the root causes of women's mental health issues. By validating their experiences and providing compassionate care, THC offers a path toward healing and empowerment. Section 7. By the time the second decade of the 21st century was underway, something that had been simmering quietly for generations finally came to a boil. Women weren't just whispering about their anxiety behind closed doors anymore. They were speaking about it publicly, loudly, with names, with dates, with history. The silence had broken, and it wasn't going to close again. What had once been classified as hysteria or nerves had now been reframed, not as defect or shame, but as lived experience. And slowly, the world began to reckon with a profound truth. Women's anxiety had never been irrational. It had been ignored. That shift in perspective was monumental, because for the first time in history, society began not only to give names to women's mental health struggles, but to contextualize them, to look at anxiety not as an isolated chemical event, but as a response to systems, patterns, trauma, and generational pressure. This wasn't about individual weakness anymore. It was about survival in a world that often demanded emotional perfection in exchange for acceptance. Women were no longer asking, "What's wrong with me?" They were asking, "Who benefits from me believing that something is?" And in that question was power. As trauma-informed care gained traction in psychological circles, the broader cultural conversation started shifting too. Bookshelves filled with titles that challenged old narratives. Memoirs from survivors, critical essays on the medicalization of women's bodies, histories of institutional abuse. Stories that had been buried were now surfacing everywhere, from podcasts to panels, from therapy rooms to TikTok. It was no longer revolutionary for a woman to say, "I have anxiety." Now the revolution was in asking why. Why are so many women anxious? Why do diagnoses like PTSD, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and high-functioning anxiety disproportionately affect women? Why does the world respond to their pain with medication before it responds with listening? And here's what those questions began to uncover. Women's anxiety isn't just personal. It's structural. It's growing up being told to be quiet, to be pretty, to be small. It's enduring microaggressions and macro expectations. It's being the emotional caretaker in homes, in relationships, in workplaces, and never being allowed to break. It's surviving abuse and being told not to be dramatic. It's managing everyone else's emotions while your own unravel. It's walking to your car at night with your keys between your fingers. It's being asked, "Are you sure that happened?" It's being told, "You're too sensitive," again and again until you believe it. And now, women were comparing notes across continents. They were discovering that the stories weren't random. They were patterned. The problem wasn't that something was wrong with them. It was that something had always been wrong around them, and they had adapted in the only way they could. Anxiety wasn't a malfunction. It was a message. And still, even as understanding deepened, the challenges remained. Therapy was more common than ever before, but still inaccessible to many due to cost, location, or cultural stigma. Medications had improved, but were often prescribed without holistic care. Online communities offered solidarity, but also brought new layers of pressure to recover quickly, to self-optimize, to turn healing into performance. And while mental health awareness had entered the mainstream, so had mental health branding. Self-care became a buzzword. Empowerment was merchandised. Anxious but cute t-shirts appeared on shelves. Guided journals flooded Amazon. Meditation apps promised transformation in 5 minutes or less. There were products, hashtags, influencers. And while some of it was helpful, much of it was hollow. Because anxiety doesn't dissolve with a scented candle. It doesn't vanish because you color-coded your planner. And the pressure to look healed became, for many, just another source of distress. But through the noise, something real endured: community. Not the curated kind. The kind that happened in group chats at midnight. In support groups formed in living rooms. In DM threads between strangers who said, "Me too." It was in those moments, raw, unpolished, unrehearsed, that women began to find something they had been denied for generations: each other. And through those connections, they discovered that healing didn't look like perfection. It looked like truth. Some days you go for a walk and feel the sun on your skin and think, "Maybe I'm okay." Other days you cry in the shower and cancel plans and forget how to breathe. Both days are part of healing. Both are valid. Both deserve gentleness. Because healing isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. A messy, uneven, beautiful spiral. And for women who had spent their entire lives being told to be quiet, to be small, to be palatable, speaking their messy truth was a radical act. It still is. So in this era of glossy Instagram reels and productivity hacks disguised as self-care, remember, your anxiety doesn't make you less. It doesn't make you weak. It doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. And more than that, it makes you part of a lineage of women who felt it before there was a word for it, who survived it when there was no help for it, who carried it in silence so that one day, someone like you could speak it out loud. You're not starting this story. You're continuing it. And somewhere, centuries ago, a woman trembling in her bed because she didn't understand what was happening to her, she hoped, without even knowing, that someone like you would come, that someone would name it, speak it, free it. And now you have. Section 8. To fully understand how deeply women's anxiety is rooted, not just in the body or the brain, but in history, we need to confront one of its most persistent sources: medical bias. Even in the 21st century, with decades of feminist thought, breakthroughs in neuroscience, and rising awareness of trauma-informed care, the healthcare system often fails to see women clearly. And that failure, for many, becomes its own source of anxiety. Let's be blunt. Women's pain is still frequently underestimated, misdiagnosed, or dismissed. Studies have shown that women are less likely to be given pain medication in emergency rooms. They're more likely to be told their symptoms are psychosomatic. And when a woman enters a doctor's office saying something's wrong, she's more likely to be asked about her stress level than to be given a proper diagnostic test. Now, imagine you're already struggling with anxiety. Maybe it's new. Maybe it's been a lifelong undercurrent. You finally work up the courage to seek help. You sit in a sterile office, heart racing, palms sweating, rehearsing how to explain something that doesn't always have words. And the doctor responds with, "Are you sure you're not just overwhelmed? Maybe you need a break. Try not to worry so much." You leave not just untreated, but gaslit. And the worst part? You start to question yourself. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe it is in my head. That doubt becomes a new kind of weight, one that compounds the original anxiety with shame. And it happens far more often than most care to admit. This pattern is especially devastating when the anxiety stems from real, tangible trauma, like abuse, chronic illness, or discrimination. Women of color, LGBTQ plus women, disabled women. These groups face even more layers of skepticism, more hoops to jump through, more statistics stacked against them. For example, Black women in the U.S. are significantly more likely to have their physical and mental health concerns dismissed or downplayed by medical professionals. Latinas and Asian women often face language and cultural barriers that result in incomplete care. Indigenous women are routinely excluded from large-scale health research altogether. When your body is already sounding the alarm and the system still doesn't believe you, what do? You internalize. You adapt. You minimize. And that's where high-functioning anxiety is born. This is the kind of anxiety that doesn't always look like panic attacks or emotional breakdowns. It looks like overachieving, like perfectionism, like people-pleasing. It's waking up early, crushing deadlines, smiling through meetings, then crying in your car because no one knows how hard it is to hold yourself together every day. High-functioning anxiety is praised by workplaces, rewarded by schools, encouraged by culture, because it's productive. It gets things done, but underneath, it's exhausting, it's isolating, it's unsustainable. And the most insidious part is that it hides in plain sight. These women don't look anxious, they look capable. So their anxiety is rarely named, rarely treated, and rarely understood. Until it's too late. Burnout, breakdown, collapse. And then, finally, someone says, "Why didn't you ask for help?" Because the system made it so difficult. Because women were taught to be caregivers, not care receivers. Because asking for help is still seen as weakness, especially when your entire identity has been built on being the one who holds it all together. And yet, even in this landscape of neglect and misdiagnosis, women keep fighting to reclaim their stories. They're learning to name high-functioning anxiety before it explodes. They're rejecting the idea that being endlessly busy is a badge of honor. They're setting boundaries, real ones, not just hashtags. They're saying no. They're saying not today. They're saying, I matter, even when I'm not producing. That shift doesn't come easily. Generational patterns don't unravel overnight. Many of us were raised by women who never got to speak their truth, who never had the luxury of pausing, who suffered in silence and taught us, by example, to do the same. But each time a woman chooses rest over guilt, honesty over performance, therapy over silence, she rewrites that pattern. And each time she does, she offers the next generation a softer place to land. Because let's be clear, the goal isn't just to reduce symptoms. It's to create a world where women don't have to develop anxiety to survive. That's a cultural shift, a systemic one. And yes, it starts small. In conversations, in policy, in schools, in how we talk to our daughters, our coworkers, our friends. It starts with listening, really listening, when someone says they're not okay. It starts with believing them. So when a woman says she's anxious, don't offer a productivity hack. Don't suggest yoga. Ask her what she needs. Ask her what she's carrying. Ask her when the last time was that someone really saw her. Because she's not being dramatic. She's not being needy. She's showing you the courage it takes to speak out in a world that still doesn't know how to hold female fear without trying to fix, dismiss, or monetize it. And if you're that woman, if you're the one who's been holding it in, hiding it well, managing everyone else while barely managing yourself, this is for you. You don't have to collapse to be worthy of care. You don't have to smile to be believed. You don't have to explain your pain in a way that makes someone else comfortable. You just have to speak, and that's enough. Section 9. As we enter the present day, one thing is abundantly clear. Women's anxiety is no longer hidden in the shadows. It's front and center in our culture. But that visibility, while powerful, comes with a paradox. The world is finally acknowledging that women struggle with anxiety. but it's still failing to truly support them in the ways that matter. Mental health awareness is everywhere. Celebrities post about panic attacks. Brands run mental health campaigns during Mental Health Awareness Month. Therapy is discussed casually on social media. Memes joke about spiraling while sipping iced coffee. And for many, that visibility is validating. After centuries of silence, women can finally speak without being labeled hysterical, unstable, or dangerous. But awareness doesn't equal action. Because while anxiety is now part of the conversation, the systems around women haven't changed fast enough to meet their needs. Women are still navigating a world built on contradictions. You're supposed to be strong, but not intimidating. Vulnerable, but not messy. Open about your struggles, but not so open that it makes others uncomfortable. You can say, I have anxiety, but you'd better still meet every deadline, keep your household running, maintain your friendships, and never, ever inconvenience anyone with your symptoms. The message is clear. Talk about your anxiety. Just don't let it disrupt anything. And so, we arrive at the current era of performative vulnerability. A strange place where women are encouraged to share their struggles online, but only if it's digestible, only if it's curated, only if it ends with a takeaway or a silver lining. You can cry, but make sure it's in a car selfie with good lighting. You can admit you're overwhelmed, but be sure to frame it as a lesson. You can share your worst moment, as long as you're already past it. But what about the women who aren't past it? What about the ones still in the thick of it? The ones who haven't found the right therapist, or can't afford one, or are still waiting 6 months for an intake call? What about the ones still waking up every morning with dread and going to bed every night wondering if they're broken? For those women, the Instagram quote graphics and pastel journal prompts don't help. They sting. They remind you that even healing has a standard now, that even your pain needs to be aesthetically pleasing. And underneath all of it, the question still echoes, am I doing this right? Healing, surviving, coping, living. It's exhausting. And yet, there's still hope. Because even within this exhausting maze of expectations, a quieter movement is growing. One that isn't loud or polished. One that doesn't get many likes. But it's real. It's women choosing to be honest, even when it's messy. It's group texts where no one pretends to be okay. It's therapy sessions that don't have tidy resolutions. It's books written not by experts, but by survivors. It's podcasts where the host admits they're still figuring it out. It's a friend who cancels dinner and no one takes it personally. It's someone saying, I'm not okay, and being met with, that's okay. This is what real mental health support looks like. Not branding, not productivity hacks, just space. Space to feel, to break, to rebuild, to not have answers. And slowly, that space is expanding. More therapists are embracing intersectional, trauma-informed frameworks. More workplaces are, finally, acknowledging burnout as more than laziness. More communities are popping up to support women who don't fit the resilient queen mold. Because while resilience is beautiful, rest is sacred. For too long, women have been praised for surviving, for being strong despite it all. But strength shouldn't be the price of being taken seriously. You shouldn't have to collapse for someone to ask what you need. You shouldn't have to articulate your trauma perfectly for it to matter. And if you've ever felt like your anxiety needed to be justified, quantified, or prettied up to be accepted, know this. Your experience is valid, even if it's not Instagrammable. Your healing is meaningful, even if it's not linear. Your fear is real, even if it's inconvenient. And your story matters, even if you're not ready to tell it yet. Because the truth is, women's anxiety has always been real. What's new is that it's finally being recognized, not as weakness, not as pathology, but as evidence of what you've survived. You're not broken. You are adapting. You are not fragile. You are feeling. You are not failing. You are carrying more than most can see. And in this era, where everything is documented, measured, marketed, what a radical thing it is to simply exist in your truth. No filters, no explanations, no neat little bow at the end. Just breath, just presence, just being here, still trying. That's the revolution. Section 10. To understand where we're heading, we must also understand what still remains. Because while we've come far, from wandering wombs to wellness apps, women's anxiety continues to be shaped by forces that go far beyond biology. It's not simply about serotonin levels or nervous energy. It's about how society treats women who express need, who ask for space, who feel too deeply, who refuse to shrink. And one of the most powerful and overlooked forces in that equation is intergenerational trauma. It's a phrase that sounds academic at first, maybe too heavy or clinical. But in truth, it's something many women live without even realizing it. It's the anxiety you carry that doesn't seem to have a direct source. The fear that lives in your body before your brain can find a reason. It's waking up with dread and not knowing why. It's over-apologizing, bracing for anger, avoiding conflict at all costs, shrinking before you're even told to. And it often doesn't start with you. Maybe it started with your mother, or her mother. Maybe it started in a war zone, or a kitchen, or a hospital, or a marriage. Maybe it started in a time when women had no words for what they felt, only silence. And that silence didn't just fade away. It was inherited. Science now backs what generations have known intuitively. Trauma can be passed down, not just through behaviors or beliefs, but biologically. Studies have shown that the children and grandchildren of trauma survivors often carry physiological markers of that trauma. Altered stress responses, heightened cortisol levels, increased vulnerability to anxiety and depression. In other words, your anxiety may be the echo of a scream your ancestors were never allowed to make. Consider the woman who lived through a war, who hid her panic because there was no time to cry, who pushed it down and called it strength. She taught her daughter to stay quiet, to be polite, to never show too much emotion. Her daughter taught the same. And now, generations later, that same family line has a young woman who flinches at loud noises, who apologizes for asking questions, who can't sleep through the night. She doesn't know why, but her body remembers. This is the legacy of unspoken pain. And for women, it's not just personal, it's political. It's cultural. It's systemic. Because for centuries, society told women to carry the emotional weight of the world, and to do so silently. They were the caregivers, the peacekeepers, the emotional shock absorbers. Their distress was expected to be invisible, their anger digestible, their breakdowns private. So even now, when a woman speaks her anxiety aloud, she is doing something radical. She is breaking a chain. She's saying, this ends with me. And that work? That emotional unthreading of generations of silence? It is hard. It is painful. It is slow. But it is the work of freedom. It looks like therapy, yes. But also looks like boundary setting. Like saying no. Like disappointing people who are used to you saying yes. Like resting when your impulse is to please. Like not fixing someone else's discomfort. Like allowing yourself to be inconvenient. Because for women raised to be pleasant above all else, even mild boundary setting can feel like violence. But the nervous system doesn't lie. When your hands shake after sending a text that simply says, I can't make it, that's the echo. When your chest tightens after telling someone they hurt you, that's the echo. When your voice trembles because you said how you actually feel, that's the echo. But every time you do it, the echo gets quieter. And in that quiet, something new begins, repatterning. Repatterning is what happens when you respond to anxiety, not with shame or suppression, but with care. When you stop asking, why am I like this, and start asking, what does this feeling need? It's not glamorous. It's not quick. It doesn't look good on camera, but it's powerful. It looks like pausing before you say yes. It looks like taking a long way home because your body needs calm. It looks like unlearning the impulse to perform gratitude when you're hurting. It looks like crying without apologizing for it. It looks like knowing your limits and honoring them. This is not selfish. This is not weakness. This is healing. And for women, this kind of healing is especially potent because it doesn't just serve the individual, it serves the lineage. It teaches the next generation that feelings are not flaws. That rest is not laziness. That tears are not something to be hidden. And make no mistake, the next generation is watching. They're watching how we cope, how we speak, how we hold space for ourselves. how we treat our own anxiety. And from that, they learn what's possible. So if you're still struggling, if you feel like you're behind, like you haven't figured it all out yet, remember, you are still part of the unbreaking. Even if your hands are shaking, even if your voice cracks, even if you're scared, especially if you're scared. Because to feel your anxiety and still move toward healing, that is bravery of the highest kind. Section 11. As the 2020s unfold, we find ourselves standing in a strange crossroads, where the understanding of women's anxiety has never been more advanced, and yet the world itself seems more anxiety-inducing than ever. It's as if history, after centuries of building pressure, finally handed us both the diagnosis and the stress test at the same time. A global pandemic, social unrest, economic uncertainty, climate anxiety, relentless digital overstimulation, and all of it landing on the shoulders of women who were already carrying too much. And so, the question echoes louder than ever. How do women heal in a world that keeps wounding them? The COVID-19 pandemic didn't invent anxiety, but it did expose its infrastructure. It showed how little support existed, how fast the burden of care fell onto women, and how thin the line between managing and breaking down really is. In the early days of lockdowns, schools closed, offices went remote, hospitals filled, and women picked up the slack. Childcare, elder care, remote learning, emotional labor, household management, it all quietly returned to their domain. Even professional women, many of whom had spent years building careers and identities outside the home, found themselves expected to revert overnight into full-time caregivers and crisis managers. Zoom calls were scheduled around nap times. Deadlines were met at 2 a.m. And all the while, the unspoken expectation lingered. Stay composed. Don't let it show. The result? A silent mental health epidemic layered beneath the visible one. Studies began to emerge showing a sharp spike in anxiety and depression among women, especially mothers, caregivers, and frontline workers. The symptoms weren't new, but the intensity was. Panic attacks during grocery runs, insomnia stretching into weeks, intrusive thoughts while folding laundry, emotional numbness that wouldn't lift. And still, many women didn't seek help. Because who had the time, the space, the energy to explain what they couldn't even name? Instead, they pushed through, managed, smiled on video calls, answered emails with crying toddlers in their laps, made dinner while watching the news spiral into chaos. They survived. Again, just like always. But something else happened, too. Something quiet and revolutionary. Women began to name their limits. For the first time in decades, burnout became a public conversation, not a personal failure. And this time, it wasn't just whispered in therapy or exchanged between friends. It made headlines. Viral essays, corporate memos, resignation letters, podcasts. Women were walking away from jobs, roles, expectations that no longer served them. They weren't just managing their anxiety. They were listening to it. Because when the entire world stops and you're still expected to function like nothing happened, something inside you shifts. You begin to question every assumption you've lived by. Why do I always have to be the strong one? Why is rest something I have to earn? Why am I apologizing for being overwhelmed in a pandemic? And perhaps most importantly, what would my life look like if I treated my anxiety as wisdom instead of weakness? That question became a key, and many women began unlocking new paths. Some changed careers. Others left relationships that had long been draining them. Some moved, started over, went back to school. Others stayed exactly where they were, but changed how they lived. Slower mornings, softer routines, more no S, less guilt. They weren't cured, but they were conscious, awake to their patterns, aware of what their bodies were trying to say. And through it all, the digital world continued to evolve, offering both solace and pressure. On one hand, women found community through mental health accounts, anonymous support groups, and candid creators sharing their own anxiety stories. On the other, the internet remained a double-edged sword. Endless advice, comparison, and the subtle performance of healing that made many women feel like they were falling short. Because what happens when you're still anxious after trying all the things. You bought the weighted blanket. You did the yoga. You drank the chamomile tea. You journaled. You set boundaries. You found a therapist. You tried medication. You read the books. You took the walks. And still, the tight chest, the restless sleep, the spiraling thoughts. Does that mean you failed? Absolutely not. It means your anxiety isn't a problem to be fixed. It's a part of your story, a reflection of your environment, your experiences, your wiring, and your resilience. And healing isn't a straight path. It's cyclical. Some days you climb. Some days you lie flat on the floor. Both are valid. Both are healing. Because healing isn't always visible. It doesn't always come with clarity or closure. Sometimes it just means choosing not to abandon yourself again. And if you're doing that, even imperfectly, you're doing enough. So let's pause here and hold that truth for a moment. You don't need to be symptom-free to be proud of yourself. You don't need to explain your anxiety to deserve rest. You don't need to be done healing to be worthy of peace. The world may not always understand that, but your nervous system will. And somewhere deep in your body, beyond the fear, beyond the fatigue, is a knowing, a memory, a whisper from all the women who came before you, who carried their pain in silence and dreamed of a future where someone like you could simply be. You are that future. Section 12. As we move deeper into the present, one truth has become increasingly unavoidable. The language around women's anxiety has evolved. The science has advanced, and the world is more aware than it's ever been. Yet the lived experience of anxiety often remains just as heavy, because naming the problem is not the same as solving it. And knowing why you feel anxious doesn't make the weight any easier to carry. Now, more than ever, anxiety has become a near-constant companion for many women. Not just a clinical diagnosis, but a background hum, a low-frequency buzz that follows them through their routines. It's there when they wake up, when they scroll through headlines, when they check their emails, when they parent, when they lead meetings, when they sit in traffic, when they try to fall asleep. It's a kind of anticipatory vigilance. Not panic always, but readiness. For what? They're not even sure. But the body remembers. There's always something coming. And in this moment of collective overwhelm, one of the hardest things to face is that anxiety makes sense. It's a logical, even intelligent response to a culture built on burnout, to climate collapse, to social media doom scrolling, to economic instability, to generational pressure, to caregiving without support, to being told constantly, subtly, that your worth is measured by how much you can endure. So yes, your body is on alert. Yes, your nervous system is exhausted. Yes, you feel like you're drowning in shoulds. And no, there's nothing wrong with you. In fact, it would be strange not to feel anxious in this world. And yet, many women still believe they're doing something wrong. They still internalize the struggle. They still whisper things to themselves like, I should have this figured out by now. Other people have it worse. Why can't I just handle it? But anxiety doesn't measure itself against other people's problems. It doesn't respond to guilt or comparison. It doesn't disappear when you remind yourself that you're lucky. If anything, guilt just adds another layer to the spiral. Now you're anxious and ashamed about being anxious. It's a cycle that countless women live with. And one of the most radical things they can do, still, even now, is tell the truth about it. Because even in 2025, the world still rewards women for pretending. Pretend you're fine. Pretend you're handling it. Pretend you're grateful for everything, even when your chest feels like it's caving in. Smile. Post. Reply to texts. Don't make anyone uncomfortable. But slowly, that pretending is losing its grip. There's a new generation of women rising, young and old, who are tired of the script, who are refusing to be palatable at the expense of their peace, who are saying, I'm not okay, without turning it into a joke, who are sharing their truth not for clout, not for applause, but because it's the only way to survive with their integrity intact. And in that refusal to pretend, something powerful happens. They begin to redefine what strength looks like. Strength is no longer perfection. It's no longer a spotless house or a flawless resume or a curated Instagram grid. Strength is showing up messy, uncertain, anxious, and still choosing to care. Strength is setting boundaries that disappoint people. Strength is saying, I need help. Strength is leaving a situation that makes you sick, even if you don't have a backup plan. Strength is rest, stillness, slowness, space. And perhaps most importantly, strength is community. Because if anxiety is a response to danger, then community is the signal of safety. And women have always known how to build that signal for one another. In whispers, in eye contact across crowded rooms. In text threads that say you're not crazy. In saying, me too. In remembering that your body is not a battleground. It is a barometer. Your anxiety is not a failure. It's a flare. And the question is not, how do I get rid of this? It's, what is it trying to tell me? That question is the doorway to healing. And once you walk through it, the work begins. Not the work of fixing yourself, but of unlearning everything that told you were broken. Unlearning the belief that you have to earn rest. Unlearning the voice that says you're too much. Unlearning the shame you carry for crying. Unlearning the script that tells you your value lies in what you produce. This work is slow. It's nonlinear. And often, it's invisible. There are no medals for staying in therapy. No applause for choosing silence over another task. No headlines for deciding to be gentle with yourself on a random Wednesday. But this work matters, and it ripples outward. Every time one woman gives herself permission to rest, to be real, to be messy, it creates space for others to do the same. Because this is how collective healing begins. Not with big declarations or dramatic breakthroughs, but with one woman in one moment saying, this is what I need, and then doing her best to give it to herself. Section 13. Now, as we explore this final stretch of the story, where women's anxiety stands not as a solitary struggle, but a collective experience, it's worth asking a question that isn't asked nearly enough. What would a world without anxiety look like for women? Not a world where nothing bad happens. Not a fantasy land without stress or grief or difficult days. But a world where women's anxiety is no longer dismissed, weaponized, or commodified. Where it's met with respect, care, and context. Where the systems surrounding women don't create anxiety at every turn, and then blame them for feeling it. Let's imagine that world. In this world, a woman wouldn't have to prove her pain is real to be taken seriously. She wouldn't have to translate her feelings into clinical terms or recite her symptoms in the right tone just to be believed. She could say, I'm not okay, and the world would respond not with suspicion or solutions, but with support. Doctors would listen. Employers would accommodate. Families would understand. Mental health care would be affordable, accessible, and culturally competent. Therapy wouldn't be a luxury. It wouldn't take 6 months to get an appointment. Medications would be prescribed alongside education and empathy, not as a shortcut, but as a tool in a broader, thoughtful plan. In this world, rest wouldn't be a reward. It would be a right. Women wouldn't be expected to burn out before anyone asks how they're doing. They wouldn't be congratulated for surviving situations they should have never been placed in. They wouldn't have to smile through grief, perform resilience, or collapse in private so that no one feels uncomfortable. They could just be human. And childhood would look different too. Girls would be raised with emotional language, taught to name their feelings, encouraged to cry without shame, listened to without interruption. They wouldn't be told to be nice at the expense of their instincts. They wouldn't be conditioned to please, to shrink, to over-accommodate. Their no would be honored, their boundaries respected, their fear not minimized. And if they did struggle, if anxiety still found its way in, they wouldn't be alone. Because in this world, women would no longer be isolated in their pain. They would grow up surrounded by models of honest emotion, of healthy regulation, of people who own their mental health without hiding it. The stigma would be gone. The silence would be gone. The shame would be gone. And in its place, space. Space to speak, to ask for help, to rest, to try again, to live without performing calmness for the comfort of others. This vision may sound utopian, but it's not impossible. Pieces of it already exist. In therapy rooms, in group chats, in friendships that have unlearned codependency, in parenting styles that prioritize emotional safety over obedience, in workplaces slowly shifting away from grind culture, in women who are healing out loud so the next generation doesn't have to heal in silence. These fragments are real. They're growing. And every time a woman chooses truth over performance, presence over productivity, care over perfection, she adds another piece. But even in this vision, this imagined world, we must acknowledge something else. Anxiety may never fully disappear, because it's part of being alive, of being human, of caring deeply, of living in an unpredictable, sometimes painful world. The goal isn't to erase anxiety. It's to depathologize it, to remove the shame, to meet it with tools, with context, with compassion, to see it not as a flaw, but as a flag, a signal that something needs attention, a message from your body, a part of your emotional ecosystem that deserves a seat at the table, not to be shoved into a drawer. Because when we stop fighting our anxiety, when we stop trying to cure it with hustle or hide it with shame, we can finally start to hear what it's trying to tell us. That we're tired, that we're scared, that we're holding too much, that something needs to change. And in that listening, in that surrender, comes the real work, not of fixing ourselves, but of coming home to ourselves. That's what healing actually looks like. Not smiling through pain, not checking all the boxes, not looking healed, but feeling safe in your own body, able to breathe, able to rest, able to speak, able to stop pretending. Because women have been pretending for centuries, and they are finally allowed to stop. Section 14. As we begin to bring this long story into its final chapters, it's time to return to a truth we've visited again and again, from the ancient world to today. Women's anxiety has never existed in a vacuum. It has always been shaped, twisted, magnified, suppressed by the world around it. And that world, for most of history, has not been built to hold women safely. It has been built to contain them. So it's no surprise that anxiety has become one of the most common mental health conditions experienced by women globally. What is surprising, at least to those who haven't lived it, is how normalized that anxiety has become. So normalized that many women don't even realize they're anxious. They think they're just tired, just moody, just not handling life well. Because from a very young age, women are taught to distrust their own internal signals. The child who freezes when she feels unsafe is told, "Be polite." The teenager who gets anxious around certain people is told, "You're being dramatic." The adult who hesitates before saying yes is told, "Don't make it a big deal." Again and again, girls are trained out of their instincts. They are taught to override fear with compliance, discomfort with smiles, intuition with silence. So by the time anxiety fully settles in, it's not seen as an alarm. It's seen as a flaw. And here's where that pattern gets even more insidious. When you're taught not to trust your own body, you begin to believe you deserve the symptoms. You internalize the panic. You think the tight chest is your fault, that the exhaustion is laziness, that the inability to focus means you're broken, that your fear is weakness, that your struggle is personal failure. But in truth, these are body messages. And your body is not betraying you. It's begging you to listen. It's saying something is off. Something needs to change. Please don't ignore me again. For generations, women have ignored those messages because they were taught to, because survival required it, because the world told them over and over that their needs didn't matter. But now, with language, tools, and support, a different path is possible. A path where the body is not the enemy, but the guide. And this is where modern approaches to anxiety become truly transformative, because they no longer ask you to manage your symptoms in isolation. They help you understand them in context. They look at nervous system responses as logical. They consider trauma, oppression, identity, culture. They ask what happened before they ask what's wrong. In this model, healing doesn't begin with suppression. It begins with attunement. What does that mean? It means learning to recognize what your body is saying before it has to scream. It means slowing down before you crash, saying no before you're bitter, crying before you collapse, speaking before the resentment builds. It means creating a relationship with your anxiety where you're not fighting it, but collaborating with it. You say, okay, I feel you. What do you need? And sometimes the answer is less stimulation. Sometimes it's more boundaries. Sometimes it's hydration, sleep, quiet. And sometimes it's to be believed. Because even now, in 2025, countless women are still told their anxiety is too much, that they're exaggerating, that they're overreacting. And that message is rarely about the anxiety itself. It's about the discomfort others feel around it. But here's the truth that can't be repeated enough. Asterisk, you are not too much. You are carrying too much. Asterisk. You're absorbing the weight of unsaid things. You are managing invisible labor. You are regulating yourself in situations where others refuse to meet you halfway. You're holding back emotion because you don't feel safe expressing it. Of course you're anxious. Of course you're tired. Of course you want to disappear for a while. There is no shame in that. And once that shame is removed, once the anxiety is held with compassion instead of critique, it starts to shift. Maybe not right away. Maybe not completely, but softens. It unclenches. It becomes something you can breathe with, instead of something you constantly battle. This is what we mean when we talk about nervous system regulation. Not fixing yourself, not forcing calm, but creating safety internally and externally so that your body doesn't have to live in perpetual defense. It means rewriting the stories you've been told. That crying makes you weak. That needing support makes you dependent. That anger is unattractive. That rest is lazy. That emotion is chaos. Because those stories, they're the anxiety. And rewriting them is the work of healing. And that healing, unlike the rigid, one-size-fits-all advice you've probably been fed, is deeply personal. It's not linear. It doesn't have a fixed timeline. It doesn't look like a straight path. It looks like trial and error, like small steps, like starting over again and again. And if that's what you're doing it right. Section 15. At this point in the story, we've moved through centuries of silence, misdiagnosis, and dismissal. We've followed women from the darkened corners of medieval asylums to the fluorescent glow of modern-day therapy offices. We've witnessed how their anxiety was called everything except what it really was, a normal human response to an abnormal, unsustainable level of emotional, physical, and psychological demand. But here's where the story takes its most important turn, because this is not just a history. This is also an invitation to reimagine the future of mental health, specifically through the lens of women's experience. To ask not just how did we get here, but where do we go next? And perhaps more urgently, what does real healing look like for women? Let's start by acknowledging something that modern medicine still struggles to integrate. Healing is not just about treating the individual. It's about examining the environment that individual lives in. You cannot ask women to regulate their nervous systems without also asking, what is dysregulating them? It's the unpaid labor, the wage gap, the caretaking expectations, the sexual harassment, the microaggressions, the societal beauty standards, the lack of safe spaces, the generational trauma, the medical gaslighting, the pressure to constantly be everything for everyone. These aren't just background factors. They are core variables in the anxiety equation. And until the systems around women change, the weight of healing will continue to fall entirely on their shoulders. But that doesn't mean we wait. That doesn't mean we pause our healing until the world gets better. Because healing doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be Instagrammable. It doesn't even have to be visible. It just has to be real. And real healing is messy. Sometimes it looks like canceling plans and staying in bed. Sometimes it looks like a rage you've suppressed for years finally boiling over. Sometimes it looks like crying in your car after setting a boundary. Sometimes it looks like getting it wrong, snapping, shutting down, avoiding. Sometimes it looks like finally asking for help, even though your voice shakes. And sometimes it just looks like making it to the end of the day. Barely. That is still healing. Healing is also deeply personal. What works for one woman may not work for another. Some find peace in talk therapy. Others in somatic work, EMDR, or meditation. Some need medication. Some need movement. Some need silence. Others need a scream. Some need all of the above. And healing doesn't mean you'll never feel anxious again. That's a myth, a cruel one. It implies that healing is a destination, a final state you can arrive at. It's not. It's a relationship between you and your body, between you and your past, between you and the world around you. Some days, that relationship is tender. Other days, it's tense. Both days count. What also needs to be acknowledged is that healing isn't just about you. It affects everyone around you. When a woman starts listening to her body, setting boundaries, prioritizing her peace, it disrupts every dynamic built on her silence. That's not selfish. That's inevitable, because your anxiety may have taught you to people please, to overfunction, to avoid confrontation, to hold everything together. And when you stop doing that, people notice. They may push back. They may guilt trip you. They may say, "You've changed," and they'll be right, because part of healing is changing. Part of healing is becoming someone who no longer fits the version of you they were comfortable with. And that's hard, but it's also necessary, because the goal is not to be the woman who keeps everyone else comfortable while she quietly deteriorates. The goal is to be whole, to live in a body that feels safe, to express needs without apology, to know your limits and honor them, to unlearn the belief that being exhausted is a virtue. And here's the truth. When you live that way, you don't just heal yourself. You model healing for everyone watching you. Your friends, your family, your children, your coworkers. They see you breathe before responding. They see you cry without shame. They see you say no without justification. They see you rest without guilt. And in doing so, they get permission to do the same. Because women's anxiety has never been just about the individual. It's always been about the collective. That's why it's so persistent. That's why it runs so deep. That's why it needs to be healed in community. Not through forced vulnerability or trauma dumping, but through spaces of trust. Through conversations where no one is trying to fix you. Through friendships that hold your fear without flinching. Through mutual care. Through slow mornings. Through group silence. Through shared tears. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can hear is, "You're not alone." You're not the only one who wakes up already anxious. You're not the only one who overthinks every word. You're not the only one who hides how hard it is. You're not the only one who doubts your strength. Asterisk while proving it daily star. You're not broken. You're responding. And in that response is wisdom, is clarity, is the next right step. Section 16. By now, the shape of the story is clear. We began with silence, mystified, pathologized, often punished. We traveled through centuries of misdiagnosis, spiritual blame, and scientific misunderstanding. We saw how women's anxiety was renamed and repackaged, from hysteria to neurosis to nerves, without ever being properly honored or understood. And now, in this moment, we stand face to face with the truth. The anxiety that so many women feel today is not a personal defect. It is the residue of a society still learning how to see women as full, complex, emotional human beings. And so the question becomes, how do we, individually and collectively, move forward? Because while the acknowledgement of anxiety is necessary, it's not sufficient. What women need now is not just validation, but transformation. A deeper shift. One that starts not with policy or institutions, though those matter too, but with how women relate to themselves. Let's begin with one of the most radical ideas of all, self-trust. Anxiety often makes women feel like their own minds can't be trusted, that every decision is suspect, that every instinct is up for debate, that intuition is something to suppress. But what if anxiety isn't the enemy of self-trust? What if it's the first clue that trust needs to be rebuilt? Self-trust doesn't mean you never doubt yourself. It means you no longer abandon yourself in those moments of doubt. It means saying, "I'm scared and I'm still going. I don't have all the answers, and I still believe in myself. I don't feel strong today, but I'm showing up anyway." This is not toxic positivity. This is not manifesting your way out of trauma. This is radical presence, staying with yourself when it's hard. When the world says, don't feel that, and your body says, but I do. When the voice in your head whispers, you're too much, and you whisper back, I'm enough. And that kind of presence, that's how patterns break. Because the truth is, many anxious women are not just living with their own anxiety. They're living with the emotional inheritance of all the women before them who were never allowed to feel what they felt. Their mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers. The ones who were told to hold it together. The ones who didn't have the tools, the language, or the permission to fall apart. Who pushed everything down and called it strength. Who survived, yes, but at a cost. And that cost, it was often passed down in silence. In families where no one cried. Where anger was dangerous. Where boundaries didn't exist. Where perfection was the only way to feel safe. Where rest was never modeled. Where anxiety was never named. Now, many women are the first in their lineage to even recognize that something's off. And that recognition alone is heavy. It can feel like pressure to fix everything. To be the one who breaks every cycle, heals every wound, rewrites every story. But you don't have to do it all. Breaking cycles doesn't mean never feeling anxious again. It means responding to your anxiety differently. It means offering yourself what your mother wasn't offered. It means saying what your grandmother never said. It means resting when the women before you were only ever allowed to work. It means crying when they were told to smile. It means choosing yourself when they were never given that choice. That is healing. That is resistance. That is legacy. And it's not just about looking back. It's about looking forward too. Because every time you choose to honor your anxiety, to listen to it, to hold it, to let it pass without shame, you're showing the next generation something different. You're showing them that emotions aren't enemies. That breakdowns aren't failures. That rest isn't indulgent. That presence is enough. So if you're parenting a daughter, mentoring a young woman, or simply existing in the world alongside others, you're already doing the work. By being honest, by modeling self-care that isn't performative, by being brave enough to say, I'm still learning. That alone can change everything. Because the goal isn't to be anxiety-free. The goal is to stop being afraid of your own fear. To know that when anxiety shows up, it's not a sign of failure. It's a signal that you're alive, aware, paying attention. That your body is trying to protect you. That something matters to you. That you're reaching for something, safety, connection, peace. And sometimes, the most healing thing you can say to your own anxiety is, thank you for trying to protect me. I'm listening, but I've got this now. That's not denial. That's reparenting. That's integration. And integration is the true opposite of anxiety. Not avoidance, not perfection, but wholeness. The ability to hold fear and courage in the same breath. To know that you can feel overwhelmed and still move forward. To believe that you are worthy, not despite your anxiety, but with it. Because the truth is, anxiety has taught many women things that were never taught outright. How to listen, how to pause, how to slow down, how to pay attention, how to say, this doesn't feel right, how to seek softness, how to fight for calm. So maybe anxiety isn't just a condition to be cured. Maybe it's a call, a signal, a mirror, a messenger. Not always gentle, not always clear, but worthy of being heard. As we approach the final arc of this story, one truth stands out with more clarity than ever. Women's anxiety isn't just a footnote in history. It is one of the clearest reflections of how a society treats its people. And for too long, that reflection has shown a world that demands silence, compliance, and self-erasure in exchange for acceptance. But now, something different is emerging. A new chapter, not one where anxiety disappears, but where it is finally understood, respected, and integrated into a fuller, more compassionate picture of womanhood. Because for centuries, the dominant narrative was that women were irrational, fragile, over-emotional, too sensitive, too unstable. That if they cried, they were crazy. If they dissented, they were hysterical. If they needed care, they were needy. And if they spoke the truth about their inner world, they were dangerous. Those stories were not just damaging. They were designed to disempower, to keep women questioning themselves, to ensure they remained small, palatable, manageable. But anxiety, the kind that rises in the body like a siren, has always carried another message. One that runs beneath the surface of fear. One that says, this isn't safe. This isn't right. Something has to change. And maybe that's why women's anxiety has been so feared. Because at its core, it is not weakness. It is a signal. And signals demand response. That's what we're witnessing now in real time. Women responding to their own signals. Taking their anxiety seriously, not just as a symptom to be soothed, but as a signpost. As information. As an inner knowing that deserves to be followed, not fought. This is not easy work. Listening to your anxiety, really listening, means being willing to ask hard questions. What am I tolerating that I no longer want to? Where am I overextending myself just to be liked? What am I afraid to say out loud? What parts of my life are built on fear rather than choice? Who am I without the roles I've been performing? These are not questions that get answered in one therapy session or one self-help book. They are lifelong questions, living questions, and the courage to sit with them is, in itself, healing. Because when you ask these questions, you begin to reclaim something anxiety often takes away: agency. Anxiety, unchecked, makes you feel powerless, trapped, at the mercy of your thoughts, your environment, your circumstances. But when you respond to your anxiety with curiosity instead of shame, you begin to re-enter the driver's seat of your own life. You realize you can slow down. You can opt out. You can leave. You can rest. You can say no. You can redefine success. You can be soft and still be strong. You can feel fear and still move forward. This is the revolution anxiety didn't ask for, but may have always been pointing toward. Because the end goal isn't to never feel anxious again. That's not realistic. And frankly, it's not human. The goal is to have a relationship with anxiety that is grounded, compassionate, and responsive. To see it not as a bully, but as a barometer. Not as a diagnosis, but as a dialogue. Not as a flaw, but as a form of communication. And this shift, this reframing of anxiety as something to partner with rather than something to conquer, is a profound act of resistance in a world that still pressures women to be endlessly composed, endlessly productive, endlessly silent. To partner with your anxiety is to say, I believe my body, I believe my instincts, I believe my fear is here for a reason, and I will respond with care. It's to build rituals that support your nervous system, not because a podcast told you to, but because your body asked. It's choosing practices that feel nourishing, not performative. It's understanding that healing may not look like morning routines and gratitude lists. It may look like canceling plans, turning off your phone, letting yourself cry in a hot shower, sleeping without guilt, laughing without editing, breathing without bracing. This is the slow, invisible, powerful work of liberation. And perhaps the most important part of this story is not just what it teaches us about women's pain, but what it reveals about their strength. Not the kind of strength that gets celebrated in headlines. Not the kind that's about achievement or resilience or pushing through, but the quieter, deeper strength of coming home to yourself, of saying, I feel anxious and I still belong, of honoring your limits even when no one else does, of being gentle with yourself in a world that taught you to be hard. That kind of strength doesn't always look impressive, but it is. It is the foundation of a new world, one where women don't have to suffer in silence, prove their pain, or apologize for their emotions. A world where being human is enough. Section 18. As we approach the final pages of this journey, the shape of the story becomes unmistakably clear. Women's anxiety has always been more than just a psychological condition. It's been a mirror reflecting back not only individual fears, but the collective pressures placed on women across time. It shows us not what's wrong with women, but what's been wrong with a world that has consistently misunderstood, minimized, and pathologized their pain. So what happens when that mirror is no longer used to judge, but to understand? What happens when anxiety is no longer the story of dysfunction, but the beginning of a deeper, more honest story of awakening? Because what we've learned through centuries of silence and stigma is that the most dangerous thing isn't anxiety itself. It's the shame wrapped around it. The belief that it must be hidden, managed, decorated, explained. But when that shame is stripped away and anxiety is met with truth, something remarkable happens. The woman changes. And so does everything around her. This doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, layer by layer. She no longer apologizes for needing time. She no longer forces a smile when she's unraveling inside. She no longer says, "I'm fine," when she's not. She doesn't overextend herself to avoid discomfort. She no longer sees her fear as failure, but as feedback. She may still be anxious, but now she's also sovereign. That sovereignty is hard-earned, because even in today's world, one that claims to value mental health, women are still punished for being too real, too raw, too human. The workplace wants resilience, not rumination. Social media rewards curated vulnerability, not chronic emotion. Even family systems often expect women to be the glue, to hold it together, even as they're falling apart. But slowly, that system is being disrupted because women are getting louder. Not louder in volume, but louder in presence, in truth, in refusal, in choosing rest over performance, boundaries over burnout, wholeness over perfection, nervous system regulation over people-pleasing. And with that shift, the narrative is changing. Anxiety is no longer the disqualifier. It is the doorway. It leads not just to therapy and medicine and self-care routines, but to something deeper, a reclamation of power. The power to say, "I don't exist to be palatable. My value is not tied to how well I hide my pain. I can feel afraid and still trust myself. My emotions are not inconveniences. They are data. I'm not here to manage anyone else's discomfort about my truth." That kind of power doesn't announce itself. It unfolds in late-night journal entries, in quiet walks where you finally exhale, in decisions that disappoint others but protect your peace, in emails you don't respond to, in plans you don't force yourself to keep, in softness that feels like strength for the first time. And yes, there will still be bad days. Days when the anxiety feels too loud, too heavy, too relentless. Days when all the tools fail, when rest doesn't help, when the spiral wins. But even on those days, there's a new voice now, quieter but stronger. It says, "This doesn't mean I'm back at square one. This is part of the cycle, not a step backward. I can survive this moment without abandoning myself. I don't need to be fixed. I need to be held." And when that voice is hard to hear, there is another lifeline, community. The reminder that you're not alone in this experience. That anxiety is not a personal quirk or a weakness or something that sets you apart. It's something that connects you to others who feel it too, who know the weight, who know the spiral, who know the strength it takes to simply keep going. And in that connection is a kind of medicine no therapist, app, or wellness trend can replicate. Being witnessed. To be seen in your fear, your fatigue, your fight, and still be loved. That, more than anything, heals. Because so much of women's anxiety has come from feeling unseen, from carrying too much alone, from generations of being expected to absorb what no one else would hold. But now, there's a chance to do it differently. To no longer shrink yourself to be accepted. To no longer betray your body to be productive. To no longer smile through the storm. To let the storm pass and still be standing. Because the most powerful transformation is not becoming someone new. It's becoming who you were before the world taught you to fear yourself. And anxiety, in all its discomfort, all its disruption, all its chaos, might just be the call back to that self. The self that knows what's enough, what's safe, what's true. You may still shake. You may still cry. But now you know what it means. And you're not afraid to speak it. Section 19. We've walked through the history. We've heard the echoes, from ancient myths of wandering wombs to modern burnout disguised as competence. We've seen how women's anxiety has been dismissed as madness, medicated without context, glorified when hidden, and monetized when packaged. But here, in this final stretch of the story, the question is no longer just why it happens. It's what now? Because knowledge alone isn't the end goal. Awareness is not the finish line. The real challenge and the real invitation is to take everything we now understand and translate it into a different kind of life. A slower one, a truer one, a life where anxiety isn't proof that you're failing, but an invitation to shift, to pivot, to finally live on your own terms. This is not an easy path. It's not a tidy one. There are no hacks, no shortcuts, no one-size-fits-all plan. Because healing isn't a checklist. It's a relationship with yourself, with your past, with your present body, with the truth. And for many women, beginning that relationship means facing something terrifying, the grief of who they had to become just to survive. It's the grief of looking at your anxiety and realizing it was never irrational. It was protection. It was your body's way of keeping you alert in a home that didn't feel safe. It was hypervigilance that helped you navigate a job, a relationship, a culture that expected you to shrink. It was how you adapted to being overlooked, overburdened, underheld. It worked until it didn't, because anxiety is brilliant at survival, but terrible at peace. And that's where the healing begins. When you're no longer in survival mode, but your body hasn't gotten the memo. When the war is over, but your nervous system is still on high alert. When the threat has passed, but the fear lingers in your breath, your shoulders, your stomach. This is where so many women live. In the after, the moment where safety is possible, but unfamiliar. Where calm feels foreign. Where relaxation makes you nervous. Where being happy feels suspicious. Because you spent so long in fight or flight that anything else feels wrong. This is what trauma-informed care is finally teaching us. That healing isn't just about feeling better. It's about learning to feel safe in the absence of threat. To trust that you don't have to brace anymore. To believe that you're allowed to rest. To remind your body, again and again, we're okay now. And that work? It's repetitive, quiet, slow, but it's sacred. Because when women begin to embody safety, not just preach it, not just post about it, but live it, it changes everything. It changes how they parent, how they partner, how they lead, how they rest, how they advocate, how they exist. And that shift doesn't just ripple outward. It rewrites inward, rewiring the patterns that once kept them in a loop of fear, self-abandonment, and overperformance. It's waking up and not immediately scanning for danger. It's noticing a tight chest and choosing compassion, not criticism. It's feeling the urge to overwork and choosing to pause instead. It's sitting with discomfort instead of numbing it. It's letting go of urgency. It's remembering that peace is not a luxury. It is a birthright. This is not about perfection. This is not about never spiraling again. This is about returning faster, gentler, softer, with less shame. And the irony? Once women stop fighting their anxiety, once they stop trying to conquer it, override it, hide it, it often softens. Because it's been heard. Because it's no longer screaming to be acknowledged. And in its place, something quieter arrives. A stillness. Not constant, not total, but real. A moment where you take a breath, unclench your jaw, and feel, for maybe the first time, I'm okay. And even if that moment is fleeting, asterisk you felt it star, that means it's possible. That means it's yours. From there, the question shifts from, how do I fix my anxiety, to how do I build a life where my anxiety doesn't have to be on guard all the time? And that is where transformation begins. A life of nervous system literacy. A life where presence outweighs performance. A life where softness is not weakness, but wisdom. A life where your worth is not conditional. A life where your body is home, not a battlefield. Because after everything, maybe that's what women have been looking for all along. Not a cure. Not a diagnosis, not even a breakthrough, just a home inside themselves. And now, we've arrived at the final chapter. The story of women's anxiety, once hidden in shadows and shame, has been unfolded, examined, honored. We've traced it from the ancient temples of Greece to the clinical language of modern medicine. We've watched it evolve, not because women's bodies changed, but because the world finally started listening to them. Slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. So where do we end this story? We end it not with a solution, but with a shift, a turning point, a reclamation. Because the truth is, women have always known, even when the words were wrong, even when the treatments were cruel, even when their fear was dismissed, their strength pathologized, and their voices denied. They knew. They knew something was off. They knew something had to change. And now, many are finding the language and the courage to say so out loud. That courage isn't always loud. It often whispers. It breathes slowly. It looks like pauses, like reconsideration, like saying no with full body integrity, like saying yes with your whole chest, like no longer explaining yourself. Because healing for women is not just about managing symptoms. It's about reauthoring reality, unlearning the roles written for them, writing new ones that leave space for truth, for complexity, for range. Yes, you can be anxious and grounded. You can be fearful and powerful. You can tremble and lead. You can cry and still be credible. You can rest and still be worthy. You can feel fragile and still be made of iron. This is not contradiction, it's wholeness. And the more women begin to embrace that wholeness, the more the world must evolve to meet it. Because the systems we've inherited, educational, medical, economic, relational, were never built with women's emotional lives in mind. They were built to extract, to contain, to reward numbness. And that's not sustainable. Not for any of us. So this story does not end with a ribbon. It ends with a responsibility to continue the work, to teach our children of all genders that feeling deeply is not dangerous, that emotions are not liabilities, that asking for help is not shameful, that nervous systems are sacred, that trauma is not a disqualifier from love, leadership, or JOY.TO challenge every space that still demands composure over honesty. To create institutions where crying is not cause for dismissal, but a sign of humanity. To design workplaces, schools, policies, and relationships around regulation, not exploitation. To build cultures where a woman can say, "I'm not okay," and no one flinches. That future isn't just idealistic. It's already being built. It's in the therapist's office that finally feels like safety. It's in the friend who doesn't need you to be cheerful to love you. It's in the group chat where someone says, "I'm spiraling," and gets 17 heart emojis and same. It's in the yoga class where no one's trying to be perfect. It's in the boss who says, "Take the day." It's in the partner who learns to sit with your silence instead of fixing it. It's in the small, quiet, consistent choices women make each day to choose themselves, often for the first time. This is what the future looks like. Not a perfect world, but a world with fewer masks, more slowness, more honesty, more permission, and maybe most importantly, more presence. Presence in your body, in your breath, in your truth, in your fear, in your healing. Because after everything, after centuries of being told to mute, minimize, or medicate, your presence is the most radical thing you can offer the world. To be here, in your fullness, in your anxiety, in your grace, in your mess. That is the revolution. So if you're watching this now, feeling seen, feeling the ache of recognition, feeling your chest loosen just a little, it means the story is doing what stories are meant to do, reminding you that you are not alone. You come from a long line of women who endured, survived, adapted. Now, you are here to do something more, to heal, to rest, to speak, to live. And if your anxiety shows up tomorrow, so be it. You will greet it with softness, with tools, with awareness, with the wisdom of every woman who came before you and the strength of everyone who stands beside you. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not too much. You are right on time. Breathe. And thank you for listening. If this story moved you, helped you feel seen, or gave you something to hold on to, please consider subscribing to the channel. We tell stories that matter, stories that don't just inform, but transform. Until next time, take care of yourself. And when in doubt, come back to your breath.